The Whispering Forest. Fairytales Forever, Book 1. Written by Andboo. Narrated by Hazelton. Part 1. The Tale of Never Ever. Chapter 1. Tumbleweed Town. Alan, a 15-year-old boy, and his 12-year-old sister Allison lived in a small rural community surrounded by thin roads and dirt roads to the next town, just a few miles away. Nothing was all that much extraordinary about the area, except for the huge forest at the edge of town. The strange myths about it made everyone more than happy to stay far away from it. Legends told that no one dared go in, for those who went in were never heard from or ever seen again. Alan and Allison had no other choice but to walk past the mysterious forest every day as they went to and from school. Sometimes they would hear strange noises coming from deep inside the forest, or they would feel an ominous aura emerging from it. One gray and stormy day, as they hurried past the forest on their way home from school, they heard a creepy whisper come from the forest. Unlike the whispers that they had heard in the past, this one had washed right past them and blew away with the wind. "Did you hear that?" Allison asked, stopping abruptly and looking at her brother. Alan shrugged. "It's just another whisper." Over the weeks, they had been growing curious of the strange whispers and mentioned it to some friends at school. Allison's friends, twin sisters Mary and Madison, were very intrigued, as well as Alan's best friend Tommy. One day, they decided to gather after school to explore the forest. That morning, Alan was very nervous, but Allison was excited and couldn't wait to find out what was making those whispering noises. When school ended for the day, they met in front of the school and walked together to the forest. From the outside, the forest seemed normal. The group of kids looked around, finding nothing out of place or odd happening. It just looked like an ordinary forest. "The last one in is a rotten egg!" Allison went carelessly, running in with excitement. "Allison, come back!" Alan yelled, chasing after her. Their friends called for them to stop, running in after them with concern. Chapter 2. Where the Sun Don't Shine. As they ventured inward, it became increasingly dark. The trees closed in together, their leafy tops blocking out almost every ray of light, except for a few small spots where a glimmer of sun broke through the foliage with a strange, fiery red glow. The temperature dropped too, and a strange breeze made the branches crackle as they swayed to and fro. "Where's that wind coming from?" Mary asked, hugging herself. Her sister Madison shrugged, trembling a bit. All she wanted to do was turn back, but she wouldn't leave Mary and the others behind. Eventually, they came upon a group of strange, willowing trees with scar-like markings. "What do you suppose these are?" Mary wondered out loud. Madison shrugged. "I don't know, but I wouldn't touch them." Tommy placed his hand on a marking. Suddenly, the marking began to glow purple, and an ominous voice whispered,
"My child."
"Did you hear that?" Alan asked, taking a step away from the trees. "That's not funny!" he yelled into the forest. Mary and Madison exchanged worried looks. They gasped as the scar marking Tommy had touched flared a blinding purple. "Tommy, get away from that tree," Alan said alarmingly. Tommy heard Alan's voice, but it sounded small and muffled, as if Tommy was underwater. He tried to remember what he was supposed to be doing, but he couldn't recall anything or move away from that mysterious glowing mark. The purple glow surrounded Tommy, and his eyes turned as black as a moonless night. "Tommy!" Alan yelled, diving towards him, trying to grab him and pull him free from the tree. But Tommy dissipated into the shadowy ashes and blew away with the wind. The mark on the tree began to glow brighter, and the scars on the other trees began to shine too, bathing the forest in a sinister purple darkness. Chapter 3. Runes of Ruins. They struggled to pull away from the gravity of the glow shining from the marks and the disorienting buzzing in their ears. "What's going on?" Allison yelled. "I don't know," Alan replied. "Fight it." Suddenly the glow disappeared, and the kids fell to the ground. They slowly untangled themselves from one another, sat up, and then sluggishly stood. They looked around with empty eyes and felt confused. Their empty, dark eyes looked around the forest, but saw nothing. No one said a word as a powerful gust of wind made the willow branches groan. When the wind stopped blowing, a haunting melody flowed from deep within the forest. "Does anyone hear that music?" Mary asked. They nodded. "It's beautiful," Maddie said in a flat, monotone voice. She took a step back and shook her head. For a second, her eyes had returned to normal, and fear replaced the blank look on her face. "I want to go home," she whispered. But her words were carried away by another gust of wind. She blinked, and her eyes returned to the dark pits they had been seconds before. Chapter 4. Follow the Music. A few notes of the haunting melody drifted over the kids, beckoning them to move. Allison giggled and waved to the music. Alan just faced the forest and, without saying a word, walked in the direction of the sound. The girls followed him, not saying anything either. They had lost control, mindlessly walking as if they were under a spell, feeling pulled undeniably in against their will. They whispered into the darkness, the music getting slightly louder the closer they got to it. The cold and damp wind blew over them harshly. They began to hear whispers in their ears. At first, the whispers were so soft that they could be mistaken for the faint whistling of the wind. But they gradually grew louder and louder. A deathly voice taunted them.
Never again will you see the sun give in to your fate.
A haunting laugh echoed through the forest, and the children trembled, yet their steps never faltered as they kept moving towards the music. Laughter and giggles sounded all around them, as if dancing around the group in an ever-shrinking circle. They arrived at a large circular glade. The ground of the glade was a dead brown and looked almost as if it were rotting. In the middle, they saw a shadow boy sitting on a tree stump, playing a melody on a shadow flute. The children watched in awe as small fairy-like spirits gathered around the glade and began to sing an ominous song. Alan moved towards the center of the glade, his feet dragging as if he'd been pulled. The girls were next, but Madison was less willing to join, as if a part of her subconscious refused to give in to the strange forces compelling her friends entirely. Without a thought of their own, the children began to move in time with the music. Back, forward, side to side, round and round the tree stump they danced as the music grew louder and louder. On and on they went, the steps as natural to them as if they had been born knowing the bewitching dance. The fairies and spirits glowed brighter and began a chant. As the song hit a crescendo and the notes reached an all-time high, the flute formed a beam of light around the tree stump. The fairies' chant grew louder, and the boy slowly rose up to the sky, disappearing into the dark sky. The music and chanting stopped. The last note of the flute hung on the air, as if refusing to be silenced. When the last of the music note faded, a heavy silence filled the forest. The fairies and spirits' glow grew faint, and they disappeared back into the woods. The tree stump sank into the ground abruptly, and a water well arose, taking its place. Chapter 5. Well, that's magic. The sound of burbling water inside the well could be heard rising closer and closer to the surface. Suddenly, the shadow boy appeared above the kids. He hovered over their heads like a dark cloud. Madison's eyes grew wide, and as she blinked, they once again returned to normal. "Who are you? Let us go!" she screamed, her words echoing through the forest. The shadow laughed. His laughter rattled her bones and made nearby trees topple onto the soil. A pair of red, glowing eyes appeared on the shadow's face. Madison let out a piercing scream. Then she blinked, and her eyes returned to the all-consuming darkness. The shadow flicked a shapeless limb, and the group of children were pulled quickly towards the well by a black wind. The kids struggled as the wind folded them over the lip of the well. They leaned over the well. The burbling of water grew stronger, and the water of the well began to rise.
"Drink now, my children,"
the shadow whispered with a harsh, commanding voice. "No," Madison murmured weakly. Mary shook her head and tried to pull away from the well, but the wind pushed her back down. She struggled and kicked, but an unseen force held her down. Alan was first to drink. He tried resisting, but he could not. He dunked his cupped hands into the water and took a sip. The sinister voice spoke inside his head, this time to Alan alone.
"Your friends will betray you. Your true destiny is here in the shadows."
Frozen in the binds of a dark veil, Alan watched a series of images that flowed through his mind like a movie. He watched in horror as his friends' heads were dunked one by one into the well, forcing them to drink or drown. They were dragged to the ground by a mysterious force. They coughed, screamed, and struggled as they sank into the quicksand-like dirt in despair and disappeared. "No!" Alan screamed. In response, the voice laughed, and an overwhelming number of murderous images assaulted Alan's already battered mind. He went limp with the overwhelming visions of death forsaking him. He saw his friends gathering around him, brandishing sharp objects. He watched, unable to move, as their hands came down and those objects slammed over and over into him. He saw his friends murdering him in a screeching dark nightmare that rushed through his thoughts. He noticed his sister in the distance, crying as she watched. Suddenly, the images stopped, and Alan opened his eyes. He looked around in a haze and saw the rotting soil beneath him and the dying trees above. He gasped a shallow breath, and a tear ran down his cheek. Part 2. The Pitfalls of Magic. Chapter 6. The Debts of Death. Alan came to his senses, waking up slowly. His body felt heavy like a rock. Moving took a lot of effort. His arms and legs felt like wet noodles.
"Come, my child, follow my wake into the shadows."
The voice whispered to him once again. Alan's lips began to move, mouthing the words, but no sound came out. The words flew faster and faster from his lips as his voice overlapped with that of the shadows and became one. He wandered through the darkness mindlessly, murmuring incoherent things to himself. His pitch-dark eyes roamed the surroundings, yet only seeing darkness. He approached a giant owl statue in front of a hill. The statue's eyes turned down and peered deep into the endless pools of darkness that were Alan's lifeless eyes. The stone wings of the statue slowly rose from in front of its body, making a powerful grinding sound. Alan didn't even flinch at the uncomfortable sound, nor did he move his gaze from the owl. The stone owl's wings spread wide behind as if preparing to take flight, revealing a hidden passage within. Still unconscious, Alan wandered inward through the dark and dank passage. Its musty smell tickled his nose as the ground began to slope down, taking him further into the depths of the cavern. He wandered down the passage for what seemed like an eternity, but a light ahead glowed with a sickly purple, like the scarred marks on the trees in the forest. He saw strange markings and carvings illuminate with the same light beside him as the ground began to level out. It wasn't long before he found himself inside a damp room lit with torches. There was a torch on every corner of the room, and the floor was made of stone and flooded with about an inch of water. At the end of the room stood a life-size statue of a man in a dark robe who had no face. The statue's hands were held out side by side in front of him, with his palms up, as if he was receiving something. Still without consciousness or control, Alan approached it and placed his palms to that of the statue. The torches went out, and Alan collapsed to the wet floor with a splash. His soul glided up from his body, noticing himself on the floor of the dark room. He hovered there as his soul's ethereal white glow bathed the room in light. His soul was compelled to the statue once again. Tommy's face appeared in the hood of the statue. "Alan, you must escape!" Alan's soul let out a terror-filled screech that echoed through the chamber. Chapter 7. Allison's Chains. Allison was first to open her eyes, and she let out a gasp as her eyes took in the clearing with its dead trees. Rubbing her eyes, "Where's Alan?" she asked in a groggy voice. She looked around for an answer, but Mary and Maddie were gone too. She looked at the tree stump, and then she looked up at the bright sky, yet it still seemed to be night. A strong gust of wind blew. Rustling leaves raced through the forest floor, bringing with it the sound of girls giggling and laughing. "Mary! Madison!" she shouted as she dashed off, moving quickly towards the sound of her friends. As she got closer, the laughs and giggles turned into loud, painful wailing. The wind had tricked her yet again. Mary and Maddie weren't laughing, they were crying. Allison shuffled and stumbled through the forest towards them. With a burst of energy, she refused to stop moving until she reached her friends. Allison found Mary and Madison huddled together, sobbing, crying, and wailing underneath a tree with drooping branches that seemed to be reaching out to the two girls. She rushed to them, but then she fell to the ground with weakness. Suddenly the cold wind whistled around them, and they vanished into thin air, disappearing one strand at a time like wisps of smoke. "A mirage," she murmured. "What's going on?" she whimpered. Chapter 8. Follow in My Footsteps. Allison woke to Mary shaking her. All of those thoughts ran through her mind. Her head was buzzing like agitated bees. She had no answers for what she had just seen. "You fainted," Maddie said. "Where's Alan?" she asked hopelessly. "We don't know, but we found these," Mary said, pointing at a trail of footsteps in the patches of mud and dirt that made a path through the patches of trees. They followed the footsteps to the other side of the forest. They stumbled along until eventually coming across the stone owl statue carved out of the side of the hill. "Look," Allison said, pointing at the footprints on the ground, which seemed to go right up to the owl but disappeared in front of the owl, as if whoever had been there had gone right through it. She ran up to it and pounded on the owl's chest with contempt. "Give my brother back!" she cried. Allison jumped back in shock as the wings of the owl spread, revealing the cavern. She rushed through the hollow stone opening into the passage and found the stone room, lit only by a torch in each corner. Maddie and Mary followed after her. "Alan!" she yelled as she discovered him lying lifelessly on the wet floor. She rushed over, shaking him with fear and guilt. Chapter 9. Lost Faith. Alan woke on the ground in the stone room with the girls crying over him. What happened? He thought. Allison gasped as she saw his eyes open. All of a sudden, they heard a blood-curdling squeal in the distance. The terrifying sounds sent shivers up their spines and turned their skin ice cold. "Thomas!" Alan yelled, jumping to his feet and rushing out into the forest. The girls rushed after him as he darted through the wood towards the scream. They trampled over the dying leaves and fallen trees until they made it back to the glade. They froze at the edge of the trees and watched as Tommy began to play the shadowy flute. Mary and Madison shrieked to the deathly tune and mindlessly danced along to the sinister song. The forest spirits and fairy creatures appeared again, tickling a déjà vu feeling in Allison and one of dread in Alan. "Is that Tommy?" whimpered Allison. "And are those?" The creatures of the whispering forest began chanting the evil song. Mary and Maddie were pulled closer to the tree stump. Alan watched in terror as some of the critters danced too close to Tommy, and they crumbled to the floor, vanishing into the dead ground.
Sacrifice yourself so that I may become immortal.
The evil spirit laughed through Tommy as Mary and Madison got even closer to him. Alan and Allison quickly realized that it wasn't Tommy talking, but an evil spirit possessing him. "Stop!" Allison shouted. "Get away from him!" Alan added. Tommy threw his head back and pointed a finger at them.
Don't worry, he'll be next.
Alan and Allison scrambled to find a way to stop him. Patting his left pocket, Alan pulled out his hunting knife. Allison looked at him and nodded as she took a step towards Tommy with trembling legs as she begged, "Tommy, stop! We're your friends!" Alan carefully and quietly snuck up behind Tommy, sinking his hunting knife into him over and over. Tommy squealed as he fell to the ground. A shadow emerged from his body and whisked into the forest. Allison ran over to grab Mary and Madison. She shook them as they slowly blinked their eyes to focus. They shook off their daze and became conscious again. She helped them to put some distance from them and the now vanishing tree stump. "What happened?" they asked. Allison said nothing. Looking around in a haze, Tommy saw the rotting soil below him and the dying trees above. He saw his friends gathered around him, yet keeping their distance. They were watching him die. Tommy gasped a sharp, shallow breath as a tear ran down his cheek. "Why are you standing there? Help me, please!" he cried. The kids took off running, in fright and shock. Terrified, they didn't stop running until they reached the end of the forest and saw the town ahead. Without saying a word, they knew that they could never speak of what had happened. With one last glance at the forest, they went their separate ways to their homes. "Goodbye, friends!" A voice filled with sorrow whispered in the air. For a second they stopped, but not one of them dared look back for fear of what they would see. The End. You have been listening to The Whispering Forest, Fairytales Forever, Book 1, written by Andboo, narrated by Erica Hazelton.